On the show today, we have special guest Adam F.C. Fletcher. Adam is an independent consultant, facilitator, and author, celebrated for his leadership and student engagement through soundout.org. His work empowers students to transform K-12 schools by embedding meaningful student involvement throughout education. The author of over a dozen books, including Democracy Deficit Disorder, Learning Democracy with Young People, Fletcher's unique approach is shaped by working directly with more than 500 schools in dozens of districts across the U.S. and beyond. He has been recognized as a pivotal force in fostering equitable systemic transformation. Get ready for an amazing episode.
I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-created curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Adam Fletcher, welcome to the Time for Teachership podcast.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay.
Thank you for being here. I'm so excited today to talk student voice. And specifically, I just wrote down this phrase that you use, which is meaningful student involvement. And that's really top of mind for me as we enter this conversation. Is there anything top of mind for you or that people should know as they engage in this episode with us?
It is a transformative time in education, and students have to be the main drivers. And I think that's a great place to start us off.
Nice. That is so good. And I think, that flows really nicely into my next question, which is really about freedom dreaming, right? Like, what can it be? And so Dr. Bettina Love talks about this as dreams grounded in the critique of injustice. And so what is the dream? Like, what could it be? Paint the picture for us.
For a long time, there have been people talking about unschooling and deschooling and these notions of students really being at the forefront of their own learning, of their own time, of their own lives, and really driving that experience for themselves in all forms of learning. Schools have adapted and adopted and contoured all of that in a lot of different ways. And for 20 years, I've been working with them to help get real about it. And I think part of the missing part of that component is that it is not just to young people to simply turn over their education to them and tell them to go at it. It's like giving a 16-year-old the keys to a car and tell them to figure out how to drive on their own. Right? I mean, education is what we're discovering more now than ever before is that education is the bedrock, not just of democracy, but of civil society, of being human beings in relationship to each other. Dr. King talked about the woven blanket of interdependence that we're all part of. And that's what meaningful student involvement is about. It's not about radically upending education and turning students into the drivers of their own learning so that they can take all the power and control, because that is not the struggle. The struggle is the democratization of learning, teaching, and leadership throughout all of education, all of the time, everywhere, for everyone. And that's what meaningful student involvement gives us a framework for. Is how to take that justice and do it in the most fair, most equitable, most honest, and most transformative way that we could possibly do for the benefit of all of society instead of just some young people who it can work for.
I love that. And I think a lot of times there is a huge shift when people think they're doing student voice, or, right, like what student voice is commonly like in the teachers pay teachers world or whatever student voice is, right? And there's a huge mindset shift that has to be had, I think, to do this work well and meaningfully partner with students and meaningfully do all the things you just described. What do you think is that shift for people that needs to happen before they can engage in the way you described?
There are at least three major shifts that have to happen, Lindsay, and they're at the core of teaching. They're at the core of educational leadership, and that they're at the core of parenting students today. What they come down to are these three elements. It's not about student voice at all. Because if we're being honest, I'm going to start with what it isn't and then tell you what it is. If we're being honest, student voice isn't what people make it out to be for the large part right now. It's not a synonym for student leadership. It's not a synonym for student engagement. All of these are different aspects. Student voice is any expression of any learner anywhere at any time for any reason as it relates to education, learning in schools. So with that wide open conception, we can see how the kid walking out of class and walking away from a teacher when they're yelling at them, that's student voice. That student is expressing their voice. So is the kid who puts on the suit and tie and goes and speaks at the school board meeting. But so is the kid who runs out in the hallway with the Sharpie marker after class and writes, Mrs. Jones sucks. That's student voice. It might be inconvenient. It might not do what we want it to do, when we want it to do it, how we want it to do it, where we want it to do it, for the purpose that we want it to do it. But it is student voice all the same. And so are the students who are engaged in learning and talking to each other. And so is, all of the examples that are meaningful and powerful, but they aren't the only forms of student voice. And it's important that we understand student voice for what it is. So meaningful student involvement isn't about student voice solely. Student voice isn't, it has to be more than just that. What it is about is student adult partnerships. We don't, equitable relationships between young people and adults that see the power and ability and capacity of young people and see the power and ability and capacity of adults and acts in a way that brings equity into the room and to the center of every learner's experience. So that's the first step, is student-adult partnerships. The second part is really teachers seeing adultism and understanding adultism for what it is. This word can shift what a lot of teachers think about learning, and it gets blown off, frankly. I mean, there are a lot of teachers who don't want to talk about it. Adultism is bias towards adults that results in discrimination against students, but it's bias towards adults. And when we think about our schooling system, we can understand that the entire premise of public schools today is footed in adultism. That doesn't mean that adultism is bad. Adultism is not the same thing in terms of evil and wrongdoing as racism. Racism is heinous to the core. There's never a righteous time for it. As sexism. Sexism is heinous and there's never a time for it. Adultism, that bias towards adults, is appropriate when there is a building burning down and kids don't know what to do. Adults need to grab the kid by the shirt and get him out of the building. Adultism is appropriate in different circumstances because adults do have a moral and legal and conscientious awareness that young people literally aren't capacitated. They don't have the ability to grok. They just don't get it. And that's okay because young people have things that adults don't have. And that's where the student-adult partnership comes in. But that adultism has to be checked because there is a check and a balance. When it comes to making decisions about curriculum, students have the capacity to make those decisions. Adults just don't bring them into it. When it comes to rules in school, when it comes to budgeting for education, students have the abilities to do all of these things. They have the capacity to do all of these things. And they can be empowered. They can be capacitated. They can be educated to be equitable partners in all aspects of school all the time. But we have to recognize adultism as the root of that discrimination and the reason why they're not there right now. And frankly, the reason why student voice doesn't take them there. Because simply listening to students, that can actually perpetuate adultism. And then the third part, so the first part is student-adult partnerships. The second part is adultism. The third part, and it's the slippery slope, because I call it personal engagement. Every learner has to choose to become engaged in education. They have to make a conscious or unconscious choice to step into the room and be present. And we don't put that forward in schools en masse. There are exceptional classrooms, there are exceptional schools, there are even, I will grant, exceptional districts where that happens. But those are exceptional. On par, students are not seen as personally engaged in learning, teaching, and leadership in schools. And that's where we need to shift them towards in order for meaningful student involvement to really take hold. So student-adult partnerships, adultism, facing adultism, and personal engagement, I think, are the real three pillars of meaningful student involvement today.
I love that so much. Can you share a little bit more about that last one with personal engagement? Like, what does that look like? And when we don't see it, what does that look like maybe?
So for a long time, educators have talked about student engagement as kind of a proxy or a synonym for compliance. If you do what I want, when I want, I see you engaged. And the fact of the matter is, personal engagement moves beyond student engagement, because it allows that anything a person chooses to do over and over again is engagement. And it gets back to that sticky space that we were talking about with student voice and the misunderstanding in terms of personal engagement does not equate positive engagement. It does not necessitate adult approval. When a student chooses to become personally engaged in school, they might be showing up because the coolest boy or girl they ever saw is in that classroom and they just want to be there in their space. They might be showing up because that one teacher at that one time got that one hook to bring them back personally in their affect, not necessarily for the curriculum, not necessarily for the teaching, not necessarily even for the assessment, but because there was a personal relationship that was at the middle of it. There are some students who go to school and they're engaged in the rigor. There are some students who go to school and they are engaged in the meaning and relevancy of it all. But the fact of the matter is, every student has to choose, consciously or unconsciously, to become engaged in schools. And that is the real deal maker and breaker in the entire conversation. When we look at the most effective student-led learning, it's because students are choosing consciously to become engaged in learning. But even that unconscious engagement can bring them into that space as meaningfully involved. But we have to make the space for personal engagement to be at the forefront of learning, teaching, and leadership throughout K-12 schools. From the time that a kid is a kid, all the way through graduation. I want to imagine, and I want to sit with, and I want to envision, and then I want to see the 12th grade student who's graduated from high school, who's experienced personal engagement in learning, teaching, and leadership in schools from kindergarten through 12th grade, who's experienced the prospect of facing adultism from kindergarten through 12th grade, who's experienced student-adult partnerships from kindergarten through 12th grade, who's experienced this whole umbrella of meaningful student involvement all the way through. And the way that they do that is with those three elements. The prospect of that, the empowered learner on the other side of that, isn't just an empowered learner at that point. They are empowered lowercase d Democrat. They are empowered lowercase c community member. They are an empowered family member. They are conscientious citizens or members of our community. They just have so many more capacities and abilities and realized potential than students who are coming out of the system right now or ever before. And that's really what meaningful student involvement's about, Lindsay.
That's a beautiful description. Thank you for that. And very distinct and more comprehensive than I think many people think, right? That or are acting on. So I love that. I also want to ask, I want to move to kind of like the actions, like how do we make this come to life? And I know you do a ton of work on that. So I have a couple kind of questions around this. So you mentioned just now, curriculum and budget participation, students involved in those decisions. I'm thinking that takes some structure, like some structures that enable that and bring students in and that ongoing invitation. So I'm curious about that. I'm also curious simultaneously maybe about the skill building that I think you nodded to, this idea that in my definition of student voice for my dissertation, or student leadership, I should say, I said really the structures are a component or need to be a component, right? Like the skill building, the capacity building has to be part of it. Otherwise, we're doing what you said, just like student voice, we're just listening. So I'm curious about all of these structures that really invite and support students to do this in meaningful partnership.
So I want to tell you about two different tools. One of the things that I did, Lindsay, early on in my career, I worked for Washington State's Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. It's the state's education agency for the whole state. 295 districts around the state, thousands of schools, millions of students. And in my role there, I was the first ever student engagement specialist. I took it upon myself to collect 3,000 examples of when students said school was meaningful. Sometimes that happened in forums and in small focus groups around the state. Sometimes it happened through research reviews, but I dug and dug and dug and dug. And what consistently came out were a series of patterns. They just began to emerge. And I want to tell you about two of them. One is this three-legged stool. This three-legged stool showed that when students were talking about transforming education, when they were talking about meaningful involvement for themselves, they were either talking about the structure of schools, which you've talked about. It's any formal component of school systems, whether that's a committee, whether that's a board, or a curriculum is a structural component of schools. Assessments are a structural component. Classroom rules, school rules, the student discipline handbook, all these different formal components of schools. They are what we can see. They are what we can touch. The design of a school building is part of the structure, all of these things. The second thing that they talked about was the culture of schools. That shared feeling, that shared sentiment that we all have. Meaningful involvement can focus on the culture of schools. In West Seattle, at West Seattle High School in Seattle, they had for the longest time, their mascot was the Indians. And in the late 90s, 25 plus years ago, these students activated and they went to the school board and they fought to change the racist mascot of West Seattle High School. It took 3 years. And during that 3 years, the Alumni Association for the school fought them. The district fought them. The students were threatened with expulsion. I mean, all kinds of crap. But after 3 years, the courts agreed with the students and the mascot was changed. Tangible cultural change in a school, and it transformed the entire face of the school, and today the Indians are a long gone memory from that racist mascot that they were. But students really saw the culture as needing to be transformed, and the systemization of that white supremacy through that cultural icon as affecting their education. They changed it. They transformed it. So we have the structure schools, we have the culture of schools, but then the third part, that's the tricky part, and it's the attitude. Structure, culture, and attitudes. So culture is that shared component that we all have as a community, as a learning community. Our attitudes are our individual, our personal component, and they are what we each control. And this is where work around mindsets, this is where work around, facing our internalized white supremacy, facing all of our discriminations, and really being earnest and honest about who we are, how we are, where we are in the world, and working with that. All that sounds kind of heady, and it's all these things. But the awesome part was that in those 3,000 examples, I saw another pattern emerge. So I call that the three-legged stool of school transformation. Culture, structure, attitudes. The three-legged stool of school transformation. Then I saw in the stories another pattern emerge that I call the cycle of student engagement. And the cycle of student engagement has 5 distinct points on it, but it's a cycle. So imagine this is an unending circle that's going around and around. And rather than just being a circle, it's actually a spiral, but that's another conversation. At the top of the cycle is the act of listening. We do have to start somewhere, and for a lot of places, starting that somewhere is listening to students and actually giving the opportunity to share their voices. That can't be the only thing. That's the starting point. The next part after that is validating students. It means sometimes saying yes, sometimes saying no, sometimes asking probing questions and going further inquiring. But in some way, we are validating students. Yes, you're a fellow human being, and I hear that you are sharing words. The third thing is authorizing students, giving them the authority that they need to tell their own story. Author. Right? Giving them the authority. And that can happen either through education, it can happen through positioning, it can happen in a lot of different ways. But in some ways, students gain the authority to tell their own stories.
Hi, this is Stacy popping in to share this episode's freebie, Frameworks for Meaningful Student Involvement. You can get this resource and more by visiting www.lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/258. Now back to the show.
The fourth part of the cycle of student engagement is action. And action is awesome because it's where we see the rubber hit the road. It's where we see the equity actually come to form and take its true shape and color and size and smell and flavor and outcomes and all the things. And then after the action, we reflect on it. And that reflection becomes a fifth element. And then we use that reflection to reinform the process of listening because this is a cycle that never ends. And in the cycle of student engagement, it can start on the hyper-personal level, a student and a teacher in a conversation at one time. It can also be a guide to classroom planning for the entire school year. It can also be how we operate our committees. It can also provide the structure for assessing all of this. Did we do these 5 things? Because what my study has shown specifically and consistently is that when those 5 cylinders are hit, it's actually doing stuff. Students feel like they are heard, but it's more than that. Students feel like they're taking action. Teachers see action, but it's more than that. Because that reflection, the other thing that it does is ties the learning from this cycle back into the classroom. So that instead of being an anomalous or situational kind of exposure to the structure of schools, students actually learn about the structure of education as it relates to their education. Budgeting suddenly goes from being some "ooh, numbers in the sky" to being a very concrete, sequential, oh, this is how that process works, and it's helped me learn my classroom learning that much better. Culture suddenly goes from this kind of amoebus big thing that we do at home or we do it in church or we do in the neighborhood to being something that we can interact with here in school as soon as I walk out in the hallway. How awesome is that? Oh, wait, I don't have to wait to walk out in the hallway. I can do it right here in the classroom. So we take these big amoebus concepts that the stool of school transformation presents, and we put them into concrete sequential activities that students can learn from, can grow from, and develop with and evolve with in the form of the cycle. And it's just these super practical patterns that really come out that make meaningful student involvement very tangible at every grade level and for every learner ability. No matter whether a student is NDL, identifies as a neurodivergent learner, whether they identify as a high achieving learner, whatever their identity is, they all have a place inside of that cycle of student engagement.
I really appreciate this. I'm drawing here all these pictures that you're saying. So I love the visual metaphor as well. Super cool. Okay, so I know you've done a bunch of projects and work with youth adult partnerships or student adult partnerships. Can you give us like a snapshot of one? Like what's something that, yeah, either you're currently working on or really proud of, past work?
Yeah, totally. It's funny because I think both about that huge, big stuff. I had a project with the National PTA where I helped them design a policy institute for students to become policy influencers on the state level across the country. But we did it on the national level so that they could really see what that federal policy looked like. And that project was massive, and it was fun, and it was engaging, and it had lots of adults, and it had lots of students, and it had lots of impact, and it was super, super cool. But it's just as cool to think about a school in Southeast Washington. It's called Dayton High School. And Dayton had this really powerful principal who was really determined to infuse meaningful student involvement into their school. The school was actually a K-12, and they wanted to focus on high school specifically. I managed to, over the course of just a 3-week process, we conducted a massive training for students as facilitators to be able to really understand meaningful involvement and to get their peers' opinions and ideas and thoughts about school transformation and what that meant. And then we moved those students from being facilitators of student forums, where we had every single high school student sharing their thoughts about school transformation. We brought those to the school committee, and then we brought those to the student body. So the school committee became accountable to the student body for transformation. And then we faced the prospect of, okay, can we actually do this with middle and elementary kids? And when the principal opened that ability up, the whole project changed. It changed the tenor of the school. It changed the feeling of the school, because people, suddenly these high school students were connected with lower elementary students in a very meaningful and tangible way. But the outcomes of the transformation that students thought they wanted at the high school level, they connected to actually happening at the elementary level. And so suddenly learning became a partnership for kindergartners. And leadership became a growth prospect that evolved from 4th grade all the way through 12th grade. And it really just shifted the entire school. So there are lots of ways to look at these kinds of transformations. Some happen on those really big levels. Some happen on the very personal classroom level. I had a teacher friend in Florida. She was a 3rd grade teacher who worked with neurodivergent learners, and she used meaningful student involvement to plan her entire classroom curriculum, as much of it as she could, for one school year, just to see what the difference would be. And in the course of that school year, teaching art, teaching science, teaching reading, teaching math, teaching all those elemental components that she had to focus on with Florida's really strict way of being, she felt that meaningful student involvement in those frameworks were capable of transforming her classroom in ways that none of the standardized curriculum that she got, none of the standardized trainings that she got could ever meet, because she was able to first customize it, but do it with an intentionality and a purpose that she'd never felt in learning and teaching before. And it was just this beautiful evolution of an individual teacher in one classroom, despite having a principal who didn't necessarily seem aligned with her objectives, despite having parents who were unsure of, what are you doing again? She was able to shift the tone of the classroom and do it in a way that was appropriate and powerful, but discreet and capable because she understood what meaningful student involvement was and what it could do. So those transformations can happen on a lot of different levels in a lot of different ways.
I love that because sometimes we have people who are listening that are, teachers in a classroom. Some are family members, some are leaders, some are organization leaders who support educators. So I love that you just gave us those three concrete examples. I'm also thinking about the people who are really into the work. I mean, the Florida example got me thinking, right? Like they're really interested in doing, the labor of meaningful student involvement, and they face a challenge of some kind. What is maybe one of those challenges that you've seen people face, and how have you kind of see them get through it or help them through it? What advice would you give if people do face that challenge?
One of the things that we don't like to talk about outside of educational leadership is the reality that even on the district level, but definitely on state levels all across the United States, there is a lot of competition in education. There are competing values, there are competing agendas, there are competing outcomes, and ultimately there are competing budgets and funding sources that are asking us to do a lot of different things. And one of the most detrimental things that I've seen to this entire process is the assumption that people are going to collaborate. I've made the assumption, okay, people are going to collaborate in this space, when in reality, they bring it in as another tool for competition. And they see that students, and they believe and they understand that students' agenda is different than adults' agendas, and they see that as a competition. They see and believe that meaningfulness is a competitor to authoritarianism, and they see that as a competition. They see that they believe that democracy shouldn't be the outcome of education, that it should be about productivity and worker placement, and they see that as a competition. So all those things acting in competition becomes very spiteful and can become very, very, it can create a very competitive environment. One of my favorite states for all of this work is in the Northeast, and it's a place where they have very advanced structure for student-adult partnerships. They've taught the nation about a lot of things with regards to their work in student-adult partnerships, and my work there was met with competition and a real sense that one association could not collaborate with the next in order to foster this, and they saw it as being a competitive place. And it's just that kind of attitude, it's that kind of perspective that can really tear apart the future of students, but also, as we're seeing today, tear apart the future of the country. Because frankly, that competition is doing nothing to build community. It's doing nothing to build collaboration, and it's doing nothing to transform schools, which we know is what the future demands. Lindsay, part of the real at the heart of meaningful student involvement today, and one of the biggest things that's transformed about my own thinking in the last 25 years, is the reality that the role of technology, and specifically AI in schools, is going to be so massive, and it already is, and it's going to become more massive, and that transforming nature of schools to where it is so student driven, or appears as such. We need a Ginsu Nice that can just come in and slice through that myth. Because the fact of the matter is, all this AI is driven by corporate interests. It's all driven by political agendas. It's all driven, and we know this. This is in the plain now. So if we pretend like it's going to come into schools without that agenda, we are not just fooling ourselves, we're fooling learners. And what meaningful student involvement can do is capacitate learners and capacitate teachers and capacitate school leaders and give them the ability to discern and see through that mythology, but also to counter it with the unique ability of humans to guide our own learning, teaching, and leadership in schools for the entirety of the future. But meaningful student involvement really gives that ability and makes it present and front and foremost in the entire conversation. And that's why it's so dang relevant today.
Oh my gosh, that's powerful. And I think a lot of people are grappling with that. So thank you for giving us and meaningful student involvement is an answer. Here we go. So, okay, love that. We have talked a lot about a lot of big picture things and big transformation. This is actually going to air in a systems transformation mini series. So I think people are thinking big, and I want to think about the starter step to get people there. So what's maybe one thing someone just ended engaging with the episode and they want to kind of start the ball rolling? What's one thing they can do to get that started?
One of the most important things about meaningful student involvement is to understand that this is not an innate or natural scheme. I am not going to pretend that everybody has the ability to meaningfully involve students. It's just not there. We come from colleges of education that are based on authoritarianism and totalitarianism and command and control environments and. We work inside of systems that insist the same thing. So the very first thing that anyone can do, whether they are a student or a teacher or a leader or a parent, is to learn about meaningful student involvement. Get online. I have so many free books. The starting point is called The Guide to Meaningful Student Involvement by Adam Fletcher. You Google it and it will come up in a dozen different places. And just take that first step of learning about meaningful student involvement. Because those elemental steps, there are stories, there are frameworks, there are so many different ways to enter into this conversation, but we've got to start at the starting point. You know, in systems thinking, they say start anywhere and go everywhere. Absolutely do that as soon as you've read The Guide to Meaningful Student Involvement. Don't reinterpret, don't reinvent the wheel. And that's frankly what a lot of districts have taken it upon themselves to do. They are concerned about using one person's idea, it's not just my idea. Meaningful student involvement is actually a concept that's been transformative and emerged throughout education since the time of Leo Tolstoy in the early 20th century. You know, it's really come around in all these different ways. There's so many different bases for it. And that emergence, it's an evolution of a whole grain of learning, teaching, and leadership in schools that maybe even goes back to Ben Franklin. You know, that very notion of you can't have a democracy without informed members of the community, of the people who can make the democratic choices. And meaningful student involvement positions people to do that. So start with the beginning. Learn about meaningful student involvement, and then go from there. Start anywhere and go everywhere. If you're a classroom teacher, try meaningful student involvement in one lesson plan. Use that cycle of engagement. Use student-adult partnerships. Just face the adultism that you have as a teacher. Start there. If you're a building leader, host a training. Get that guide to meaningful student involvement and learn it yourself and share that. But the fact of the matter is you got to learn about it to begin it.
I love that. Yeah, so many of the things that you have talked about today, I'm like, oh, that reminds me of this person. That reminds me, like, this work is all like very synergistic. And I love your frame around like collaboration over competition. And yes, I'm here for all of that. And I just want to close out by asking two final questions. One, this could be for fun or could be related to what we're talking about, but what is something you've been learning about lately?
Oh, something I've been learning about lately. You know, a couple of years ago, I wrote a book that was called The Democracy Deficit Disorder, Learning Democracy with Young People. And it was all footed in this notion that there were a lot of things leading up to this moment in American society. And I learned about a lot of them, especially from the lenses of young people. Today, I am really focused on learning about the lenses of non-white people and really putting that forward. Because when I talk to African Americans in my life, that's not all African Americans, that's not a monolithic African American, but from a diversity of perspectives and backgrounds, I get to hear, oh, we knew this was coming. When I talk to Indigenous people and Native Americans, I get to hear, oh, we knew this has been happening. For people of color, ICE and that whole phenomenon is not something new. The de-democratization of America is not something new. It's been an ongoing process, and this is merely the latest manifestation. It might be the worst manifestation in a long time. It might be, all of those things. But learning about it from other people's perspectives in this way, especially people who are being actively silenced right now, woof, it's just mind-blowing to me and is really shifting my lens and helping me to understand there is a legacy that we have to confront in a very deliberate way. And I am heartened by the prospect of meaningful student involvement being a component of that transformation in the future. And it's one of many. So let's keep going, and I'm going to keep learning and, really growing from it.
I love that you shared that. And there's such an intersection, right? With like thinking about youth and thinking about just even the racial demographics and makeup of youth today and what that will continue to be. That is so synergistic with anti-racist pedagogies, right? With Indigenous theory, like with all of these ways of being and learning and knowing, they're just so synergistic. And I love that you brought that in. Thank you.
Yep.
Finally, where can people listen to you learn more about you or listen to you or connect with you, read your books, any of the things?
Yeah. So, my handle is Adam FC Fletcher. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebooks. I'm on the LinkedIn's, but I also have a massive website at adamfletcher.net. And that website has all my free publications, more than 50 free publications for schools and youth serving organizations and a variety of different people to really enter into this work and find the next space. I'm also available for consulting and speaking and training and all those things too. AdamFletcher.net.
And I just want to say on behalf of the audience and myself, I just really appreciate that you offer all of that for free as well. I think that in a time of budget cuts where I know people around Massachusetts right now, we are have multiple districts cutting almost 100 positions, and it is pretty dire straits. So thank you for that. That seems really, really generous.
Absolutely.
And cool. Adam, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Lindsay. I really appreciate the opportunity.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no-strings-attached brainstorm call at lindsayBethLyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. We'll see you on the next episode.